The Trump administration is starting the week faced with two major foreign policy issues. The first is Russia ramping up its revenge with plans to expel more than 50 British diplomats and workers as the UN approves a fresh round of sanctions against North Korea. But which is the bigger threat? Joining me now is Senior Fellow for the Heritage Foundation, James Carafano. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We really appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
So let's begin with what Senator Lindsey Graham had to say in reference to what he believes President Trump should do in reference to Russia and North Korea. Listen.
If I were Trump, I'd look at the Reagan playbook and economically isolate Russia. I think the problem is that Russia's running wild. This maximum pressure campaign against North Korea launched by the Trump administration, where the world is beginning to follow, has paid off. Here's the goal of the negotiations: to make sure that North Korea gives up their nuclear program.
All right. So what did you think about that?
So I think on North Korea, the senator is exactly right. So the administration's strategy is maximum pressure until North Korea is no longer a nuclear threat to the U.S. or its allies. That's missile defense, nuclear deterrence, conventional deterrence, heavy sanctioning. Keep it in place. It's exactly the right strategy, regardless of how these talks turn out. You know, in Russia, the problem is, look, we're not going back to the Cold War. We're not going to have a hard sphere of distinction between Russia and the West. Russian economic connections, even despite the sanctions, they're there. But what the United States needs to do is what this administration is actually doing. If you look at U.S. policy, the last 2 years, it's actually the toughest we've been on Russia in over a decade.
But do you think that there needs to be greater economic sanctions against Russia? We can actually put the screen up there for you. Russia has expelled diplomats at this point from 25 different countries, those countries that stood beside Great Britain. Is there more that we can do?
Well, there is, and the law passed last year by Congress gives the administration the tools to do that, and they started doing that just recently. I think rather than the carpet bombing sanctions, particularly in the case of Russia and places like Iran, very targeted sanctions against individuals, particularly on their assets in the West, where a lot of these Russian oligarchs hide their money and their worth. That's worth going after. And the administration's actually been pretty sophisticated and disciplined in doing that.
I want to go back to what you were saying about North Korea, and we can pull this up as we continue to talk about it. The UN sanctions on North Korea, they include 13 North Korean oil tankers, 12 other ships and cargo vessels. 2 other North Korean vessels have been hit with a global assets freeze. 21 shipping companies, 12 North Korean firms blacklisted, along with this Taiwanese businessman. Now, this is different because it's UN sanctions. The U.S. has had sanctions against North Korea previously, right?
Yeah, so let me tell you what's important about this is, you know, people often say that North Korea is the most heavily sanctioned country on the planet. And that was always true on paper, but not in practice, because there are a lot of loopholes that the U.S. didn't push people to close simply because we didn't want to antagonize China. And what this administration has done is they've actually gradually and systematically started closing those loopholes so the North Koreans really, really feel the pressure. That is totally different. That has not been done in over a decade.
Got it. And so I know you also said that the big question for you and others is what happens next in the Middle East.
I think that's right. I think we got a strategy for Russia and China, and it's solid, and it just plays out over time. What people are looking at as administration has identified the right threats. The great destabilizing threats in the region are Iran, ISIS, and al-Qaeda. But the question is, what's the next steps on doing that? What are we going to do about Iran? And what are we going to do about Syria as an extension of the Iranian problem? And then there's a lot of questions about that.
Yeah, whether or not we should pull out of Syria. I know Lindsey Graham over the weekend said it could be the single worst decision that President Trump makes if he does that. So that's up for debate. Lots to talk about, lots going on around the world. James Carafano, thank you so much for joining us to break it down.